Good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome to everyone of you for joining us for the Festival of Social Science event, Art, Digitalisation and Other Stories. So I'm very happy to see so many of you here, and I look forward to a day rich with insights, perspectives and discussions. So the title, Art, Digitalisation and Other Stories, is a title which is partly drawing inspiration from the academic Peter Schmuck's thoughts on creativity and digitalization. The idea which Schmuck has on digitalization, which we borrow, is that to understand what constitute digital lives of the arts and artists, we also need some of the other stories that reveal the cultural context within these, should we say, artistic landscapes. So the takeaway is basically that digitalization can transform how art and culture is produced and shared, as you probably all very well know. But that doesn't necessarily alter the way we experience their value or their aesthetics. So we are hosting this showcase today as part of the annual MA Showcase in Arts Management to tell you some of these stories and to introduce you through those stories by the research of several students from a current cohort. Some of these projects will explore the impact of digitalization directly. Others focus on different but equally relevant topics. We also have a keynote that will reflect on the relationship between digital and offline spaces. And finally, we'll all gather for a panel discussion, moderated by Kristin Osborne, which will delve into today's theme through the lens of place-based arts and culture. So at the core of our discussion today is an understanding that beyond what we hear about constantly, AI, digitalization, platforms, we are still in a position where the creation, distribution, access to and experience of arts and culture happens across a range of platforms. But these platforms don't always fall neatly into online or offline categories. This is why the title mentioned digitalization and other stories. We aim to highlight examples where offline and online spaces complement one another. So the first topic of the day is the student presentation from our current cohorts. So we will have a video recording of 3 dissertation projects. First up will be Elizabeth Alexander on how digital platforms are reshaping careers in the music industry. That will be followed by Casey Manch, who will examine ethical decision-making in arts management. Before finally, Aoife Osborne will explore performance spaces in immersive theatre. So let's have the recordings.
In 2023, prior to a sold-out tour in Western Europe, an American alt-rock indie band's 5-year-old song became the most used song on TikTok. As the friend of a band member, I was able to attend their Amsterdam show, where I watched as everyone in the crowd videoed the band or themselves witnessing the song live. I realized then that this song had significantly impacted the night's overall attendance, and it showed the amount of power digital platforms now hold over the industry. This piqued my curiosity around how digitalization has affected artists' careers. Previous literature on the digitalization of the music industry has placed artists in a democratized environment where the rise of digital platforms led to disintermediation, or what was believed to be the elimination of cultural intermediaries. However, instead of the platforms creating equitable competition amongst a vast amount of music, research shows that platform power has led to the replacement of intermediaries, or reintermediation, forcing record labels to make room for the digital actors within the industry. This has created a system where the value chain is dependent upon what's popular in the market and has produced a new environment where platform presence is a requirement for progress. Yet in a landscape where there is unlimited access to cultural products, there remains uncertainty around how artists are chosen by the market and their value established by the platforms, leaving them in an unpredictable career. As a result, the study answers the research question, how have digital platforms affected artists' labor practices and career management strategies in the music industry, particularly regarding social and financial implications and relationships with cultural intermediaries? The project focused on a single case study around the alt-rock indie band to gain a deeper and more personal understanding of the effects of digitalization in a real-world scenario, bringing light to the strategic decision-making processes artists employ to navigate them. Semi-structured interviews were used to collect qualitative data from 3 industry professionals, a band member, the band's manager, and a leading academic expert specializing in music streaming and digitalization. Through thematic analysis, I used empirical triangulation to examine and analyze the commonalities, differences, and relationships between the interview participants' experiences. Findings show that digitalization has transformed the music industry into an environment where career progression is dependent on if artists can navigate an unpredictable system where value is based on being discovered amongst an unlimited amount of music. In response, the study explored the role of serendipity as a complex mechanism of establishing product value within reintermediation. Through this lens, we can see that it's not an outcome of random luck, but an intentional process where artists and industry professionals create circumstances to increase their visibility, market value, and potential career progression. The study also highlights the discourse around the role of digital platforms as cultural intermediaries. It shows that while digital success doesn't guarantee career progression, it does hold significant influence over distribution and audience reach, which contributes to the debate around whether digitalization truly democratized the industry or just reinstated new cultural intermediaries in the place of old ones. It not only emphasizes the complex landscape artists must navigate to achieve success, but leaves the industry's current structure open to new interpretations, which uncovers the dual nature of digital platforms as both a coordinator of growth and of unwanted cost. While the unlimited access to audiences generates market recognition and new opportunities, it also initiates challenges such as financial instability and mental health pressures due to the constant exposure and need for engagement. It shows that serendipitous processes are not linear, and while there are those that have managed to navigate power structures to achieve market recognition and career progression, there are others who lack the same result due to an absence of resources, support system, or willpower that it takes to sustain visibility. As a result, the study offers an informed approach to managing the complexities of this environment, allowing an understanding of how artists and managers can better position themselves to capitalize on emerging opportunities and overcome potential threats. It also suggests that greater attention be given to the infrastructure supporting artists' personal and creative endeavors, specifically around social well-being and financial stability.
Hello, my name is Casey Manch. Today I will be presenting my dissertation, Balancing Ethics and Economic Survival, a Scoping Literature Review. The research question for this literature review was, what is known about ethical decision-making in post-COVID-19 arts management scholarship? The research objectives were to synthesize fragmented literature, identify gaps in theoretical overlap, and to establish a structured base for future research. This research is grounded in a relativist ontology and an interpretivist epistemology. This qualitative research utilized a scoping literature review, employing a structured search strategy across selected academic databases and journals. To enhance reliability, the study applied inclusion and exclusion criteria focused on peer-reviewed publications from 2020 to 2024. Reflexive thematic analysis was employed, emphasizing researcher reflexivity and contextual interpretation to identify themes and gaps in the literature. The main findings for this research are as follows. Research in the field regarding ethical decision-making is highly fragmented. Synthesized, the field reveals a complex relationship between political and economic forces that are creating an environment of financial survival. This environment influences ethical decision-making in arts management as organizations make decisions for financial survival rather than long-term ethical responsibility. There is a lack of cross-referencing between scholars in the field, indicating a lack of knowledge building and research being done in a siloed manner. There is an array of theories being used in research. However, There is an overlap between institutional, stakeholder, cultural capital, and public value theory, which reveals a shared focus on issues of power, equity, and governance in arts management, suggesting that the field is increasingly concerned with balancing financial sustainability, equitable access, and social responsibility. The most prominent conversations regarding ethical decision-making in the field currently are regarding staffing, digital transformation, ethical sponsorship, artist support, and collaborative governance. Research in the field is notably veering into business ethics, discussing collaborative governance and alternative leadership models. Research also shows an increasing focus on social responsibility ethics. However, financial and bureaucratic constraints often reduce these efforts to superficial actions rather than meaningful social change. This highlights the need for structural reform to aid arts organizations in genuinely fulfilling their ethical commitments. Based on these findings, future research should prioritize interdisciplinary collaboration between academics and practitioners, conduct longitudinal studies on the sustainability of post-pandemic ethical decisions, investigate the impact of diverse leadership on ethical practices, conduct studies to bridge the gap between personal and institutional ethics, and work towards addressing the balance between financial survival and meaningful social responsibility. Thank you for listening and attending this event.
Hi there, my name is Aoife and this is my presentation on my dissertation From Pop-Up to Permanence, Choosing Long-Term Performance Spaces in Immersive Theatre. Immersive theatre makers and companies have taken a significant shift away from short-term and pop-up installations towards longer-term, dedicated, and even self-described permanent installations. In a post-pandemic environment and in the midst of public funding cuts and a cost of living crisis, this presents many potential challenges and benefits. This research examined the factors which influence these decisions of theatre makers to move towards long-term performance spaces and the processes that these decisions follow. Following a literature review and the development of this project's original inspiration, 2 research questions were presented. First, what are the decisions involved in immersive theatre companies choosing and developing long-term spaces? And second, what factors influence decisions to choose long-term performance spaces? This study drew on primary and secondary data. Individual interviews were conducted with 7 participants with varying levels of experience across venues and spaces to represent as many views as possible. And existing data in documents, including journalism, industry reports, academic readings, and policy reports, were examined. Thematic analysis of data was conducted to find recurring and similar themes across these data sets. Through this thematic analysis, 4 themes informed the findings of this research. First, the issue of sourcing space. Participants reflected on a lack of suitable, affordable space to use in immersive theatre productions. Participants also acknowledged the need to accept offered space, even if they weren't originally looking for space. Next, participants and documents emphasized the importance of audience experience, both that they would be truly immersed in a production from a creative and artistic standpoint, but also that a space would be safe, accessible, and easy to locate. The data also revealed the benefits and challenges of space, largely focused on the costs and resources required to run a dedicated space, but equally the many uses of a space and the security and stability that access to a long-term space provided. Finally, participants noted a desire to grow the immersive theatre ecosystem, especially to support developing artists and new companies. To reflect on this project's research questions and what these findings mean, the decision-making processes of immersive theatre makers for permanent or long-term venues range from highly considered and detailed searches for space to spur-of-the-moment decisions to use offered spaces. Stakeholder needs, including those of audiences, funders, and other immersive theatre makers, are strong contributing factors in decision-making, But decision makers encounter many levels of competing priorities in their attempt to secure stability through dedicated spaces. In this need to balance artistic considerations with practical and strategic elements, decisions to pursue long-term space by immersive theatre makers are influenced by a multitude of cultural, strategic, and economic challenges, which leaves no clear right or wrong answer in choosing space. Ultimately, this research has found that whether participants were offered space or actively sought a venue, their decisions were founded on an underlying desire for stability and security in a challenging environment. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Now we have come to the moment where I'm going to introduce you to our keynote speaker, and I will just say first and foremost that I'm very, very excited that we can have Dr. Carolina Dalla Chiesa here with us today, because I can think of actually no better scholar positioned to actually take us through some of the ambiguities and complementarities of the digital and the offline. So a few words about Carolina, which I think is a brilliant scholar. She's a cultural economist and anthropologist. She has been conducting over the year loads of fascinating research into what she herself described as the evolving production and consumption of arts and culture in the digital age. Does that mean necessarily digital? Well, I will let Carolina answer that question, but what I can say is that Carolina's expertise is broad. She does work with cultural organization, on arts funding, on models of patronage, and the socio-economic characteristic of cultural markets. She has done extensive work on crowdfunding and crowdsourcing as innovative solution for arts funding and policy, while at the same time she's also worked and done extensive research on the exploration of collective, community-driven approaches and artistic communities, meaning that it is a research approach which juxtaposes the digital and the offline. So Carolina will now take us through a keynote, which I've just seen the headlights of, which looks very exciting, but I will leave the floor to you, Carolina, to enlighten us. So please give her a warm welcome.
Okay, so hello everybody. Good afternoon. How you doing? Yes, good, decent. I'm doing very well, and I think, well, I couldn't do a better introduction of myself than Anders did. Anders, thank you very much. You've been really kind with this lovely, lovely introduction. I'm not going to explain too much about myself, since Anders has already done a wonderful introduction. My point here today is talk about hybridity matters, cultural production in post-digitalization. Anders, please let me know when I'm going too much further my time. I hope I'm going to stay around 30-35 minutes, but please let me know. And during the speech, I'll also read most of my notes. It helps me organize my thoughts, and afterwards we can have our discussion here together. And I want to first also thank deeply not only Anders, but also all the staff members I got to know these 2 days here at Queen's University Belfast. I say wholeheartedly that you have one of the most beautiful campus and places where you can explore humanities, arts, music, production. Is really vibrant place, and I really mean it with all honesty. And to me, such a privilege to be here to share a little bit of my impressions about the changing nature of cultural production post-digitalization. I've been very fascinated by what does it mean to be a creator in a digital context? What does it mean to be an early stage career aspiring creator, artist within the context of digital platforms? So I will possibly pose a bit more questions and threads, open threads here, then give some clear-cut answers. And I'll raise some hypotheses which possibly need empirics to advance. And well, over my not too long career as an academic, people have called me sometimes too optimistic, too pessimistic. You will make your own decision about it later on. We're going to talk about it. But I would consider myself mostly as a hybrid, and I think it's important that we see the positives and the negatives and consequences for us as creators, academics, policymakers. Also, just as an anecdote, in the spirit of collaboration, I got to know Anders because we were doing research and crowdfunding. And basically, as far as I knew at that moment, we were the only two persons on earth doing a research and crowdfunding in culture at that moment. And I called Anders and I said, I can't believe we're now working together. We have to collaborate and not compete. And this is why we're also here today. Cut it after 3 years, we're launching a book next year on funding and financing models for the arts. Anders mentioned I'm a mix of cultural economist and cultural anthropologist. I try to put two hats in different moments. Fortunately or unfortunately, depends on how much of a domain purist you are. I sit in between these domains. And I personally don't see it as a stark oppositions, but I often navigate between these different poles. And I also believe I'm in a plenary of very interdisciplinary people here, so I hope it resonates with you. In my research, I'm deeply interested in what digitalization means to cultural sectors, what does it mean for individual creators, early stage, beginners, makers, trying to make sense of this plethora of oversupply of digital production. How can we navigate that? So the point of my talk today is that I will think of culture production contemporarily as more of a hybrid form. So not only local, not only global, not only homogeneous, not only heterogeneous, not only individual, collective, private, public, but mostly a hybridization between these two poles and these dichotomies that we sometimes create to make sense of the world. Hence the topic of my talk today. So I have 3 goals and I hope we can reach the third. And part of my talk is rather optimistic and the other part I would say more not pessimistic, but looking at the flip coin of digitalization, I want to understand how digitalization makes culture more hybrid, and if it actually does, right? If this is a possible hypothesis we can entertain. Look into the transformations of culture production. Second, what are some of the contentions issues, right? So when we flip the coin, what do we have to beware of? Should we consider as creators, policymakers, but mostly academics, as I am one of them too, in the post-digitalization? And if we think of policy, what is some possible ways forward for that? And the reason why I bring policy here, it's because I think policy making is perhaps within a conundrum, and those 2 arguments have been put forward many years already in discourses in economics, policy making, whether we should delve into a more merit good argument, consumer sovereignty argument. So just to explore it very briefly, when we talk about a merit good argument, I'm following here Hans Abing, Ruthausen, Michael Rushton, so not alone in this observation. Art is considered of a merit, right, a merit good, when we attribute value to it externally to any market-oriented valuation. So when we understand that art has a value in itself. So for example, we understand that heritage deserves to be protected even when audiences fall. See, for example, the cases of some operas and non-superstar museums that struggle to ensure audience. We would say, well, we need to support them because there is a merit, an intrinsic merit. Contrary to that, we have the totally opposite pole, which is a consumer sovereign argument that would imply, consumers, audiences, they are sovereign in their tastes and preferences. When we buy a ticket and go to a festival, that is a review preference. I know what I like, I know what I don't like, and that would be sufficient. What I try to argue is that reality perhaps lies more or less in between. And some art forms need more public support than others to survive. And the fact that some art forms have limited market value does not make them less valuable in themselves. But pragmatically, I think it poses some important issues regarding where should policymakers focus their attention to? Should we focus more attention into traditional forms of art? Should we focus more attention onto new forms of cultural production? What is culture after all? We consider a more expanded view or more traditional. Podcast, craft makers, non-institutionalized creators, are they part of this discussion or not? as I'm saying as well, budget is limited and we have to make choices. As I would try to argue in this keynote, hybrid is perhaps better. So what is hybridism? Garcia Conclini is anthropologist, very renewed anthropologist. He works with the idea of hybridism, which I use here as a very useful tool in order to understand contemporary cultural production. So what is hybridism? Hybridism is a broad cultural process whereby discrete structures or practices previously existing in separated form are combined to generate new structures. So we're not talking here about joining A and B and doing a hybrid between A and B, keeping them as they are, but creating something new. What hybrid means is making something new out of it. And let's leave it here for a moment. Let's discuss later on if we do reach that post-digitalization. For starters, when we think of public and private, we typically theorize these realms quite apart. So wide empirical evidence has warned us about the pervasiveness of private interest in public domain and vice versa. To give a more recent example, I have conducted studies on this specific platform, but also other related match funding formats where public and private action are put together. So it creates a hybrid, it creates a different outcome, not simply putting public and private together, but also making something new out of it. So in this match funding platform here for the Kunst from the Netherlands, they're the leading model on match funding for the arts. They use a crowdfunding model with public support. So basically, public institutions and private institutions can match the funding put already by backers or individual philanthropists, individual patrons. What is interesting about it is that we can entertain some forms of crowdsourcing. We can find ways to give voice. Give voice, of course, I don't mean here in a very top-down way, but mostly to reveal what perhaps is already there by using different forms of funding. With my colleagues at Erasmus University, Ellen Lotz and Joscha Weingarten, we've been investigating some factors that lead to a combination of public and private money. So what did we see here in this case? We saw that the more match funding was used within cultural production, within cultural funding, the more dispersed it became. So more geographically dispersed within the country it became. And it was an interesting solution to leverage cultural production outside city centers, right, outside the main metropolis. So I would argue here that the more public funding incorporates population will, the more legitimate it also becomes. Another typical dichotomy we usually refer to is the so-called real versus virtual, and I'm not sure if you relate to that yourself, but I contend that it's mostly a mistake to consider something virtual as unreal, right? Actually, we spend a lot of our time on, some of us perhaps, social media, Instagram, other forms, even just talking on WhatsApp, and we couldn't say that we are less real or we are less human in there. How, if we continue using so much of this dichotomies, how do we understand the virtual reality of games, the combination of being in a local area, in a local space, and contributing to something collectively online? So I'm saying here that, you know, we spend a lot of our time participating in different forms of online community. In the past, Facebook. Contemporarily, we have other forms of platforms. So as researchers, it's better that we try to investigate these lived experiences without so much preconceived judgments, whether this is right or wrong, but trying to understand what are the lived experiences there. There are some questions we also have to raise when it comes to local and global, right? Anders have mentioned that in his introduction. I'm very interested in understanding how the local becomes global, the global becomes local, and perhaps we're caught in between these two poles. And to some people, I brought here an example. I'm not sure you've seen this before. Have you seen it before? One person only, and myself too. Nobody else? But it's very interesting. Well, this woman here, a traditional cook in Azerbaijan via YouTube, reached 6 million views by, in my opinion, doing something very simple and low key in terms of its technological production, right? To some people, it must be puzzling how local stars like this Azerbaijan local cook found a way to express her identity online to people that would never have thought of this option. So, of course, the views are here not only local, they're coming from a myriad of places and increasingly thrive. I believe they increasingly look for what is authentic in cultural production amidst so much oversupply. And here I believe that also this dichotomy between global and local is too limiting. And perhaps what is most interesting to me recently, so it's something I've been delving more contemporarily, is the blurred boundaries between who do we consider amateur hobbyist and who do we consider professional. When we look into people producing music at home or having all equipment available to make podcasts, crafts, production at home, do they consider themselves amateurs, hobbyists, professionals? When do we transition from one to another? And it has been deeply puzzling to me to understand how these two domains perhaps become more hybrid more recently. I've been conducting recently research with my colleague Femke van der Berg from Groningen University, a survey and a qualitative analysis of Twitch for musicians. So we're basically looking at different videos and understanding how musicians put themselves online. And one thing we have noticed in this research is that what matters here is not so much the final outcome that you bring into an audience, but the process, sharing the process, making it attune to someone's audiences. And to me, and I hope perhaps to some of you, this is also the case, is quite fascinating how, well, you know, we use a home space, you use your environment to produce something to local or global audiences. Some things that we can discuss here is the extent to which household production becomes also a gendered subject, right? The home has always been a place where we produce things, where we make things, where we've been creative, and it has been gendered too. So when we put digital platforms in the contemporary term, does that change anything or it doesn't? So to me, par excellence, we can think of the household as a locus of creativity. Perhaps it has always been. This economy, as I'm mentioning here, it's not certainly not only about who produces, but also about who consumes, who watches, who the audience is. I would say a quick look into Netflix, a quick look into Spotify and other platforms. We are subject to an oversupply of production, right? How much time do you spend deciding what you're going to watch, right? I'm not sure about you. We can do a survey on that, but the oversupply of information, the overload of information is perhaps too much, and at least in my case, I've been delving back to TV because I want somebody to tell me also what to consume, right? Those are some things that have been made evident post-digitalization too. And basically because we don't have enough time to look at it all. So the dichotomies between public and private and home space are very dear to me. I've been looking into some examples like when you produce ceramics and sell it on Etsy, who is producing, who makes that, how do you consider yourself an amateur, professional? Does that become a main source of income? And we may be here slowly rethinking our way back to a public space, but via the internet, which I think is interesting. So in the past, we could think of co-working spaces as domains where we would go and create and collaborate and talk to other people. But is that so now, right? We can ask whether this is the same case more contemporarily. Just as a brief example, I brought here a research that I've done with Anders from a research perspective. I believe this brings some important questions regarding non-institutionalized forms of innovation, different ways of thinking innovation more contemporary. In this recent article, me and Anders were arguing that some innovative solutions have moved online. They have emerge from the online, but with a local component. So, and I promise this is only one of the examples I'm going to bring from research. I won't delve too much into that. So while some of these effects that we see creating a urban, local, and digital middle ground has emerged, we also see that it breeds from territoriality. I want to just briefly show this graph here. It comes from my PhD dissertation, and promise this is the second graph I'm showing here. What I wanna portray here is that context really matters. What kind of cultural products become spread? What kind of cultural products are more locally, more home bias determined? So in this study, I'm showing here that in one line, you can see the blue line here. You see written there wider industries, right? And the other two lines are called cultural industries and other cultural arts. So what have I done here? I basically plotted the distances between each project creator and each crowdfunding donor by kilometers based on a Kickstarter database in order to check how much dispersion cultural products have, how much geographically dispersed they become. So this graph basically shows that while some domains, like the one represented by the blue line here, will be design, fashion, video games, board games, they reach a high dispersion of cultural production. The other core cultural arts, so performing arts, visual arts, literature, they tend to be very affected by home bias. So here, I think it's important that we discuss that, well, context matters, right? Not only when it comes to geographical locations, but also types of products. And perhaps that some cultural dispersion don't happen because we're not willing to support a project of a theater in Japan, right? If we cannot consume it. This all means that the experience or capacity to experience a cultural product does matter. I might not be willing to support a theater from Japan, from Belfast, but I would be willing to support fashion, games, industry, and so on. So up to this point, I have put forward a message here, which I believe is that dichotomies have to be reconsidered, right? But I use a lot the work of Zelizer, which is a mix of sociologists and economists. She says that dichotomies are typically grounded in a hostile world thesis. By hostile world, she literally means that we look at the world in dichotomies. And perhaps in our lived experiences, hybridism and more connection between these two poles, whichever they are more present. So inspired by Viviana Zelizer's view of the social world, I would reinforce here that some dichotomies we use to make sense of post-industrial world may have gone too far too often, and Zelizer would offer this interesting thesis to see how art and economics are not set apart, that cultural production and consumption are not set apart, local and global don't have to be either, and perhaps after digitalization we have more of that. This other research here I've done with a few authors, my co-authors. I delved into what we call circuit of commerce, so exploring some connections between economic lives and the commons. This very argument is put forward in this chapter, which can find the reference here, where I explore how local practices can provide a better view of commoning, collective decision-making, and they do intertwine with commerce as well, right? We don't need to see them apart. So, moving ahead, there are some consequences of this so-called post-digitalization in cultural production. And the ones I've been exploring so far are, number one, that we do have a reshaping of locus of value creation, at least from a public discourse perspective, right? Even if the household has always been a place of creation, creativity, production, nowadays we see something different when it comes to cultural innovations. Some new forms of innovation in cultural production have come to the fore more visibly with digital platforms. And the third is that Knowledge creation also happened through information sharing. So the more we share information amongst each other, the more we can expect to build knowledge together. The fourth, as I mentioned, is the emergence of some glocal context, right? Better not to look only at local and global, but situations, practices, and creation processes that tap at both at the same time. Now, let's move a little further. I want to go to the second part of my keynote, which is the flipped coin. So what is contentious about it? And you can think yourself, first of all, is there any problem in the scenario I'm showing here? Would you foresee any criticism? Is that all flowers, right? Is it all about collaboration and beauty and, yeah, you know, going online and trying your luck? As we saw some of the master theses here, it doesn't seem to be the case. So the one contentious issue I want to bring here is that, and this is empirically proven, empirically discussed, left to right, back and forth, is that digitalization has oversupplied us with products. But superstar effects are even higher. So in origin, we would have think that, so first of all, let me go back to what does it mean superstar, right? Let's establish what superstar means from a literature perspective. Superstar means that a relatively small number of people earn an enormous amount of money and dominate the activity in which they engage. This is a typical power law distribution where, let's say, 20% of the population access 80% of resources, 80% of the population access 20% of resources. So it's this power law distribution, right? I would say that, you know, when digitalization started to be theorized and thought, we had very hopeful expectations, sometimes very utopic, that we would have what it's called the long tail hypothesis. Who knows the long tail hypothesis here? Let me just see. 1, 2, 3, 4, a few. Right. So let me just explain a little bit what is the long tail hypothesis. According to Chris Anderson, on an article published in 2004 and the book in 2006, he argued without data that the future of businesses is selling less of more, right? The idea here being that if you flood online platforms with niche products coming from everywhere, if you just put them online, we will find ways to reach to them, right? Audiences will come up. So the tail basically will be longer and thicker because we have just more products and of higher attention. Now, we don't have to go too far to question, did that happen? What do you think? Can I have a yes or a no? A yes. No one, a no. We have a bit, right? And why not? We can discuss that further, right? Why it didn't happen, which is extremely fascinating. We see that based on, for example, this work by Smirnarius in a New Media and Society journal, he asks, does the long tail apply to online news? Does it apply to contemporary cultural production? He says no. The argument being very clear here, we did allow for more diversity of cultural production, but it also becomes more concentrated, right? So indeed, we do have more things. We do give voice to different niche productions everywhere. This is absolutely new with digitalization, right? It's a given. But when it comes to whether we distribute this equally, that's not true. We do have enormous higher concentration in superstar effects. The problem here is that not only this is not what we expected, but also frontally contradicts the idea that the digital utopia that we're going to have simply a more distributed, equal society online, right? So the intuition here in the long tail hypothesis was quite simple. The idea was that since the costs of the inventory, putting inventory online, were too low, because you just put products online on the digital platform, firms, right? Any of us, individuals, collectives, will have an incentive to supply content, but it doesn't mean that it does reach a consumer. The first part is true. The second part, of course, not entirely true. So my point here is that we have to be very cautious when we look into the utopian ideas that digitalization is going to make us all better off. we have to also flip the coin and understand that we do follow the crowd, and especially in moments of uncertainty, we might end up following what our peer likes, right? What our friends, our families, our closest community, and we come back to the local, right? In moments of uncertainty, we actually go back in, not necessarily expanding. So what is in for us? Well, we have to question as, of course, policymakers and researchers, how do we approach that? The second contentious issue I would like to raise here is that the modern creator, and here I'm putting the modern creator, I would put brackets, right? Because this is a little bit of generalization, puts his hands and attention everywhere. Now, would that resonate? Let's discuss it afterwards. The rise of different digital platforms, the rise of many social media together makes the contemporary creator a little bit like an octopus, right? Putting its hands everywhere, trying to build attention everywhere. And why? Why would that be the case? It's important to see that creators now more and more are pressed to build up their audiences before they become institutionalized. So showing to a potential gatekeeper, a potential intermediary, that you do have audience, which means that there is a whole labor happening prior to that with your own free work, trying to reach audiences in whatever way possible, right? And this is what I mean with the octopus creator with various legs and arms trying to build up an audience. So typical gatekeepers don't need to necessarily invest money trying to search for creators, but yourselves are doing this job. And basically, any indie label today will most likely welcome a musician if you have some audience already, right? What does it mean for labor, right? We do have an unpaid labor happening here. And since most people can call themselves artist and creator, if I access enough materials and if I can make even my living space an arts and craft oriented, I could call myself an artist, a creator. So what does it mean for policy making? How do we draw the line who is an artist and who is not? The third consequence of this scenario is that I see the institutionalization of culture production. And this is where it becomes hugely important for cultural policymakers, because traditionally cultural funding goes to institutions. But how do we reach the individual, right? If we see a flow of individual creators to a market or non-market, obviously we have many freelancers working in de-institutionalized ways. And creators then will be more dispersed, less institutionalized, and we do have to build some more empirical studies to show how this plays a role. And we can ask ourselves whether creators really need to institutionalize, the extent to which a label, an indie label, a theater, a dance company offers enough incentives for you to become institutionalized. Maybe that's not the case. Just as an anecdotal reference, in some countries like Canada, there has been very thriving discussion about music funding reaching the artist directly and not the music label, which happens in COVID, right? And under COVID cultural schemes, cultural policy schemes, most of the funding went to the institution and they didn't reach the label. Then what happened? Some institutions were investing in marketing campaigns, but not necessarily in the labor production. There we have an issue to discuss. In France, we see that the status of intermittent artists has been very helpful to make the transitions between job work, right? So if I have a job, a gig for 3 months and I don't have for other 3 months, perhaps policymaking could support me in that. The fourth and last issue I would like to raise here is that, and a bit more theoretical one, and I'm moving towards the end of my lecture, is that this diverse ongoing process of hybridization, as Garcia Canclini says, can lead to a relativizing notion of identity, relativization of the notion of identity. Now, perhaps here we're not arguing that identity is lost. On the contrary, we're seeing that perhaps as a backlash to too much hybridization, we do recur to our local spheres and to poles at the end of the day. So it can create all sorts of backlashes on political advancements too. So in fact, due to this intense hybridization I'm pointing out here, perhaps we seek more and more our roots and identities, creating cleavages where maybe it wasn't necessary. Anders, at what time am I? 3. There we go. Okay, so here what I wanted to point out is that it's not all flowers, right? Half of my speech is, well, it brings collective action, it brings crowdsourcing, it brings local voices, niches, and this is all important in order to reveal things that perhaps were invisible prior to digitalization. But on the other hand, the extreme oversupply that it has created made us remain in a bubble and also subject to certain superstar effects. And so we do have to be aware of this pressure of homogenizing culture in spite of some local identities. And I'm thinking of the phenomenon of music here made for subscription platforms with all repeated formulas, right? A quick look into how music is produced nowadays, at least from a superstar effect perspective, shows that there are repeating formulas happening. And this is very homogenizing for our consumption point of view. So some questions I want to put forward to you, right? We can discuss it after. Is hybridism, as I'm pointing here, one of the ways forward for cultural policy? So can we think of not only public and private, but maybe together, right? Not only as a result from decreasing cultural budgets worldwide, but also the fact that with some private action, we can actually get to know some niches, some places where it wouldn't be possible prior. Like so incorporating some crowdsourcing decision making. And I think from a more academic point of view, my final point here is that the object of study in this case shouldn't be itself hybridity. What is the outcome of hybridization, but more the processes of which they happen, right? We are more interested in the processes. What does it mean? How does it change how we consider ourselves creators, artists on a public or private environment? So I reiterate here that some contemporary issues should be discussed in this shade, this blurred boundary between we have some advancements, but we also have some negative points that we have to inquire. For policymakers, that is the key point in my opinion, because we do have to be attentive to local forms of artistic expression that need to exist despite lower audiences, despite a market valuation, right? So I wholeheartedly believe that there must be a way forward in between so that we don't have to be caught into extreme poles all the time. I want to thank you for your attention and for also bearing with me through this back and forth of digitalization. I put some references here if later on you want to take a look into them. And I'm looking forward to discussing with you this interesting topic. So yeah, let's move forward.
Carolina, thank you very much. That was very inspiring. Yeah. So, in terms of superstars, which you mentioned, I'm going to introduce now our panel chair. And if I say that our panel chair has raised 3 kids, is an international silver medalist in rowing, and has an MBA, that in itself, each of those achievements is, to me, being a superstar. But not just that, but over the last 20 years, she's also helped to grow the arts and culture sector here in Belfast through cultural programs in local government, and to what is now a multi-dimensional investment fund for Belfast cultural sector of over £3 million a year, alongside the 10-year cultural strategy for Belfast, a city imagining 2020 to 2030. So our chair, Christine Osborne, is the current partnership lead in the Council's cultural team and Belfast 2024 initiative, where she focuses on governance, income generation and legacy projects. Her work emphasizes the importance of culture as a driver for urban and regional development. And this is something which I believe that Christine feels very strongly about. So she's very keen that culture and the sector that drives it gets more recognition for city and regional development and success at all levels of government, which means that with Christine Osborne, we have a strong representative of the local in the glocal. So Christine, may you please come up and take your seat. And I also invite Carolina, Casey, and Aoife to join her, and we will get the discussion started.
Thank you very much, Anders. That's a very generous introduction. Thank you. Thank you all for listening in advance. So this session will last about half an hour. And the format really is the first half, I'm going to ask probing questions to our three lovely panelists, Carolina, Aoife and Casey. And then afterwards, we'll open the floor to questions. So if you don't mind saving your questions until we've had that first discussion, and also for the benefit of Alan, who's backstage MC, just to highlight, please wait until you have a microphone in front of you via Ali and Kim before speaking, because it's all being recorded. Yeah, we're very interested in what you have to say. But please save your questions till after we've had a chat. All right. Okay, so welcome everybody. Delighted to be here. And just firstly, I picked up on a few of your points, Carolina, particularly around the fact that you're an assistant professor at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. Your PhD is in cultural economics. You have a master's in cultural anthropology, but you did your master's also in management and organisational studies, as well as doing a research stint in culture and sociology in Germany. So fast and impressive CV. I humbly have, as you say, an MBA, and that was driven by my experience of working many years in local government, noticing the difference between that kind of local government approach and then the private sector, and as you say then, the kind of not-for-profit sector of the cultural and creatives in the city. And I really recognise that the crossover and intersections between businesses and the arts is not always straightforward. And it's a common language perhaps would help everyone understand the similar motivations for those profit-driven sectors and the potentially not-for-profit cultural sector. And I'm really interested in hearing how those can collide in a better way. And just could you share with us a little bit more, given your experience and grounding in that business sector, and also now your obvious passion and knowledge around the power of the cultural sector, how those links could be made?
Yes, that's a very good question. Thank you very much. It's a very good introduction. And I think it's a very difficult question to answer, right? It's basically, it's about solving a lot of, I believe, cultural policy debates that has been taking place more than a decade, right? We have people here in the plenary that are extremely knowledgeable about that too. And I think there are two ways to look at it. I think you can see from a more management point of view and from an economic point of view, and they're both complementary. I think from a management point of view, you can think of solutions that entertain co-creation, collaboration, looking at ways to bring bottom-up action and collaborate it with cultural policy, right? I think for that to happen, policymakers should be, first of all, open to the discussion and find ways to discuss with population, not only through representatives, which is something that often happens, that we are caught in people that will represent us, and that's all fair enough and efficient, but we might sometimes lack legitimacy. So it's something to discuss. What are the good ways in which we want to access local opinions without losing sight that cultural policy has a role to play, and this role must be also guided by a value-driven purpose, right? So we want to understand local realities, and we also want to understand how our vision as policymakers is putting forward something better for everyone. from an economic point of view, I would say crowdsourcing, I did hammer this perhaps too much in previous work and in my presentation. The reason why I believe crowdsourcing is quite interesting, it's because I think it's quite cheap. And it's a cheap way to find answers, right? You can literally ask people their opinion, but you have to be willing to take those opinions forward, right? We were discussing in this lunchtime today with Ali that if you give your opinion and you don't see it moving forward, you're not going to give your opinion again. You're not going to be incentivized to do that. And it's not a matter of financial incentives. We're not talking about financial incentives here, but incentive, as we're all value-driven to a certain extent in the arts and culture, we want to see our opinion moving forward. So crowdsourcing was I think a hype word, at least in the past 10 years, 15 years ago, and has lost its track. But the underlying rationale is quite simple, is, well, how do we cater to diverse opinions so that we're not caught up in our own institutionalized thinking? And that is all. But we can call it co-creation, we can call it other things, right? There's all disputes of which terms are best applied to that, but crowdsourcing is just a very simple, I say cheap here because low cost, right, way to make use of digital platforms and to reach people. Now, I don't want to take that much time to delving into that, but just the flip side coin here is everybody then has to have access to a smartphone and internet, right? So we need to be able to have a decent infrastructure in place, and I can say perhaps that's the case in many countries, developed countries, but I don't think that's the case in other contexts. So I wouldn't say it works everywhere. It's something that we have to still explore.
Definitely. And of course, how digitization really affects the quality then as well, and that kind of middle ground. And you wrote about the middle and the upper and the ground around that layer of consumption and how that has, changed our way of experiencing culture and arts. It's moved away price points. It's really challenged that whole area. And Casey, your particular area of research is looking at that. How does digitization may affect that ethical decision making and our social responsibility as creators and creatives and providers of culture and arts, and even in terms of the funders of those arts in a tough economic climate. And we're all aware of the hot topics of the inclusive growth of the developer contributions across our city, corporate social responsibility, the new B Corp phenomenon, and that risks of kind of just ticking boxes like the greenwashing of old. Now we have a bit of kind of social washing. And your research, I understand, has really looked into that. And how does that affect the sense of public value? How do organisations cope in a really limited funder environment to being ethical and making sure that they are responsible? So how much lip service do you feel is given to areas such as the diversity and equality, respect, access, inclusivity, and so on?
So thank you for the question. A lot of the discourse in ethical decision making regarding digital transformation is this in between of this is an ability to have further audience engagement. This is an ability to, I really enjoyed the glocal concept because it's something that a small theater in Belfast can reach large parts of the world. However, what's in discourse right now is these concepts of access and inclusion, and the discourse especially is around those who are economically disadvantaged, because the digital transformation, we still are working towards not cutting off such people from cultural capital and from the arts. And the digital transformation is what's currently being talked about, is how do we have ethical digital strategies, since all of this is moving so fast, How can we as institutions make decisions that are for and socially responsible to the marginalized voices, to those who don't have high-speed internet, to those who are disabled, because digital transformation also brings such groups into the arts more if we are able to have clear strategies. And in terms of funders, right now, many of these ethical decisions are being made in a financially scarce environment. And you asked the question of how can major funders help shape it? Something that's being talked about is how can institutions create clear digital strategies in order to be able to access funding, and how do we make these decisions as institutions that bring the digital transformation into our institutions while not cutting off access, and making sure that we are being inclusionary in how we are transforming the field. That's kind of what's happening in ethical discourse.
Excellent, very good. So just in that context of still securing a positive audience experience for as many people as possible, Aoife, your work is really focused on the challenges faced by organisations in terms of our economic environment, which everyone knows is really tough here. We have a lot less funding than the rest of the UK, you all know this well, less than 5 times than down in the Republic of Ireland. And the impact is massive in all kinds of ways, morally, creatively, and so on. In terms of just then, particularly immersive theatre-based organisations and practitioners, and I know you studied a lot in your work, looking at the challenges surrounding individual artists and organisations, can you give us a wee bit of insight into opportunities or any good news or kind of any positive things on the horizon that immersive theatre practitioners and organisations are able to maybe see in the future with all this digitalisation context?
I think
at place?
One of the biggest things that has come from digitalisation within the immersive theatre sector specifically is that it's not something, from my research, it's not something that participants considered pre-COVID-19. And then all of a sudden, when in-person wasn't an option and digital was the only thing people could do, that was when it started and when it took off. And that then prompted discussions around how it works better for people who maybe can't travel to a big city, in challenges where finding physical space isn't possible. Then it's what means that you can find that virtual space. The flip side of that is the conversation that we've all had of that not everybody has access to a reliable internet connection. Not everybody has access to, you know, a stable laptop or phone that will allow them to experience it in the same way. Where it has also been really encouraging is that audiences have wanted to come back to a physical space, and they have wanted to experience what I think specifically for immersive theatre just cannot be replicated in a digital context of being properly immersed. So I think as part of that, one of the positive things I've seen that I keep coming back to is this idea of the immersive ecosystem and how different organizations are working together, are pooling resources, are sharing skills, and particularly are supporting newer and upcoming artists in the industry.
And so that could be supported via networks and mentoring.
Exactly, yeah.
Partners.
So things like the development of the Immersive Experience Network has been really paramount in, particularly in a post-pandemic context and in the context of a cost of living crisis of making the most of what is available.
Very good, great. Just before we go to questions, I have one more questions from the audience. I have one more. I've actually lots of questions, but I'm trying to limit myself. So just in terms of looking at people and audiences' experience and, you know, the role of audience members in making art and, you know, the access that we all have to new technologies, new things like escape rooms and that glocal context that we now have, the ability to, and the reach of new art forms. What are the opportunities in the future for tools such as AI and digital? And what do we as creatives and organisations and funders of that need to be aware of to future-proof the sector?
Well, I will try. I think it's a difficult question to answer. I always try to engage with the topic of artificial intelligence from 2 points of view. One is labor, and the other is IP, intellectual property. So I think one of the hardest issues with artificial intelligence is that we are, like, this is in a way a form of crowdsourcing, where we're taking information from the entire internet that has been produced up to now to create something, and that creation is perhaps non-human, and the laws and regulations are still not up to date to how do you consider non-human production. For example, who owns the platform? Is that the owner of the product? In some laws, regulations specifically in the United States, you can only consider something of IP protection if it's produced by humans. So how do you consider the non-human? So I think regulation is not yet there. It's something that for creators, it's a major issue, because as I always have the puzzle of whether artists would create simply for art's sake, or whether you also want to put a protection, IP protection within this creation, right? So there are debates about the extent to which AI harms the possibility that artists would receive any revenue whatsoever, and that would crowd out motivation from artists in the future. I don't know about escape room. I have never been into one. But then when it comes to labor, what I'm concerned with is the extent to which some AI tools may replace labor within creative industries. And here I'm talking simply of, for example, in video games creation, the artistic production, like at the very beginning of the supply chain in video games production, whether that art could be replaced if in the future we have a better technology, a better AI, generative AI available for this reason. So far, what I've been seeing in the literature and at least some data reports is that it's not yet there, that the technology is not yet up to speed to do all these disruptions that we are expecting. So I think it's something to discuss in the future. I wouldn't be too bold in creating particular statement here. But I always question AI then from these 2 points of view. The issue of copyrights, the issue of IP protection, which perhaps prevents some firms to use AI because they know if I use it, then it would be available to others, and that is an IP breach, which is the case of Disney, for example. And secondly, the issue of labor, the extent to which our labor markets in the arts, which are already historically under hurdles, that would bring even more problems in the future and solutions, right? We don't want to be all full pessimistic. That's not my point. But I haven't answered your question.
No, well, I suppose it was an open, and just in terms of any kind of prospects that you've identified through your work and research.
I think for me the danger is that tech would become the be-all and end-all.
Yeah.
I think aside from the challenges that we've discussed of what tech means for people who can't always access it, as someone who does many escape rooms, some with a lot of tech and some with a lot of VR, none with AI as far as I'm aware. But it's sort of the danger of the fact that it doesn't always gratify the audience experience. And from my research of speaking to participants, it doesn't always gratify the artist either. So it's then the question of who is it actually serving? If it's not reaching the people it needs to reach, and if it isn't satisfying those that it is, would be my concern.
Indeed. Casey, do you have anything to add just in terms of quality and kind of the future?
Yeah, the quality that ethical discourse is talking about, that the digital transformation is bringing to us, is this potential for this social inclusionary space within the arts. I liked the concept of WhatsApp and real and unreal, because what's really being talked about is like there is space now for audience, not just engagement, but audience participation, audience like becoming part of the art in a way by this digital inclusion. So this is the very good thing about it, but we're still asking the questions of, but what happens if there are people who don't have access to that inclusion? When does it become exclusionary then? But what can it do in order to be able to bring people together and have in social inclusion in the arts?
Yes, great, very good. Well, I think it's time to hear any of your questions in the audience. Just put your hand up if you have a question in mind, please.
Hi, I kind of enjoyed the presentation. Thank you so much for that. And I have a very specific question. So I come from an AI background. Like I'm researching on generative AI in design. So don't worry, I'm not gonna ask about an AI question. But like you said, like all of you mentioned, like during the pandemic, most people jumped off from like tactical designing or tactical like art forms to very digital art forms. And I've seen that as well. Like like in case just in fashion design, most designers have like jumped into like designing NFTs, like gaming skins, and so on and so forth. But I've also seen that these art forms are very like consumer dependent. Like some people are like you said, like some people go off and become like superstars and sell their like digital assets for like millions, and some people just end up like quitting the jobs and getting into a field like which is not very relevant for them. So I just have a very direct question, which is like, do you ever think like this is gonna be like a mainstream career, just like any other career like people can pursue, like some generation alpha can pursue in the future?
I think the question could be directed to all of us. I would think we all have somewhat an opinion about that. But if I understand correctly, it's the issue of whether this will become the mainstream. And I think what we understand as mainstream now perhaps will change. When I'm mentioning the Twitch musician, for example, I think that's a form of cultural production that would become more mainstream. Podcast, it's something that 10 years ago nobody was listening to, and now we listen to crime stories. And by the way, they all repeat the same formula. They have a beginning, they have a middle, they have an end, and they have a formula. If you listen to Spotify, the superstar songs, they also have a formula. So if you're talking about mainstream, I would think it's not only about who is producing, but the product itself, the outcome, which is very homogenizing. And this is the flipped coin, the danger in terms of if we collectively, socially understand that art should be diverse, perhaps this is not delivering diversity. And how do we ensure diversity? This is where I think cultural policy has a role to play, to ensure some variation where our mainstream consumption has been very homogeneous, right? So the mainstream here to me is that our taste and preferences as consumers have been also reinforcing a type of cultural product that is very homogenizing. And this is intrinsically a moral question, right? Because we can go, in the beginning I mentioned in the second slide, we can go for a consumer sovereignty argument and say, yeah, but the consumer is sovereign. If you like it, then you like it. Why do I have to bother, right? If you like crime podcast in that format, that's not my problem. The other side of the argument is, well, but art has a merit in itself, and we also want to ensure avant-garde to exist, that local production that has no audience available, that they can also exist. And it's not only a matter of not having audience, they perhaps didn't even manage to reach a potential consumer, and they have to be helped in that. So the question of mainstream to me goes back to that double side problem. Do we support the arts? Do we understand arts in a consumer-oriented sovereignty perspective, or how to ensure that good activities can also have a life, so that we're not all mainstream into one form of cultural product. And just to finalize my point, I think it also comes back to what we do as as audiences and consumers, all of us here perhaps listen to some forms of music, listen to some forms of podcast, watch Netflix or whatever other platform. So we have to go back to ourselves and think, what do we consume, what type of things we like, because it's very easy to say you should do something different, but we also do have certain homogeneous forms of consumption, and on a moral point of view, there's also nothing wrong about it. But for a cultural policy view, we want to ensure some diversity. And I think that's where the tension lies.
And that's why we'll always need public sector funding, because if it's all market driven and paid for, then it's not going to be diverse. Mm-hmm. So any other comments for the question? Okay.
Okay. I was thinking your research around ethical decision making, whether you had looked into ethical consumption and the decisions made, similar to what you were just saying, kind of at the other end, and what the relationship might be between the consumer and the organisation when it comes to ethical decisions.
In the 2020 to 2024 literature, there's actually quite a large section regarding consumer behavior, trying to understand how to make decisions as an organization that is geared toward what consumer behavior is telling us right now. In the research, I saw that it almost seems to be there's a large part of the research that's trying to understand how do we see what people are liking at market value, and how do we, while staying in integrity to our institution, make decisions for where these leanings are going. And there's a little bit of a tension there, so to speak. I hope that answers your question, but there's a large section about consumer behavior right now, trying to understand it.
Given that policy is made or tends to be made at a kind of a local, regional or national level, how do you envisage policymakers engaging in this space where we're looking at both consumption and kind of cultural development that is very global and local and global and hybrid?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very good question. I'm sure you also have some points regarding that. Well, cultural policies per definition, well, we also have a scholar here, very knowledgeable on cultural policy, perhaps more than I am, but please correct me if I'm wrong. Cultural policy is always local. There is always a local component to it. And it depends on the goal of policy making, right? And the representatives that we also elect to put our voice forward to a certain extent. If we believe that the role of cultural policy and art is to provide diverse outcomes, then we have to look at cultural policy from a local perspective. Then we have to ensure bottom-up forms of artistic expression to arise. Heritage, right? Here I'm thinking of heritage, I'm thinking of preservation of languages, I'm thinking about art forms that even though they might have limited market value, that they can and they should continue existing for also its historical role, because it defines our identity, whether we like or not the idea of identity. We do relate to it quite a lot contemporarily, even the post-digital platforms, right? So per definition, I understand cultural policy is always local, has always a local component. The question is the extent to which you want to incorporate global trends within it or not. And I will go back to the issue of better ask people, better knowing different opinions, and not only doing a top-down decision-making process. There is where I think incorporating some form of match funding, crowdsourcing. I'm not saying crowdfunding per se necessarily, right? But some form of dispersion of ideas that you can incorporate in cultural policy making could be helpful to think, what are global trends that we better incorporate, and what do we what we don't want to have. I know I'm going perhaps too further in that, but I don't think there is an easy, clear-cut answer to that. And it's a socially, culturally dependent problem. Do we collectively decide that culture is about the local, or is it not? And if it's not, perhaps we don't need certain forms of protection. And if we think it is, then we can allocate budget and decision-making process for minorities, for the ones that perhaps will not be seen in a mainstream channel, right? I hope I made the point somewhat clear, but I see Anders there.
Yeah.
We have time for a couple more questions.
Uh-huh.
Any other questions?
I have just a little addition to give around that idea of cultural policy making and how that should be led by people who it affects. And Belfast City Council has been involved in a year-long programme of research with 30 partners across the 4 nations of the UK. So we took the lead on behalf of Belfast, Northern Ireland, because although we obviously focus on Belfast citizens, our focus is also on the region, Northern Ireland. Us being capital city, we have a leadership role to think of it more regionally and sometimes nationally. So basically this programme published its final report yesterday. So if you want to jump online and look up Culture Commons, it got input from various universities across the world. And so it's basically, it's called The Future of Cultural Devolution in the UK. And they went about it 3 ways. They wanted to diagnose that there was an issue about devolution and cultural policy decision making for the people, having a say in culture in their cities, their spaces, their lives, and how they experience it. Then identified a common language that worked across all stakeholders, and then they come up with a series of really useful evidence-based recommendations which will be used by various governments, local, regional, and hopefully national, and they're presenting it to Parliament and so on. So it's a really useful tool, and just loads of very useful pointers around that approach. And it's all about collaboration, and it's all about hybridization and working together, as you could almost guess it. But it's very useful because it, kind of top 6 things that we need to do as cities and so on. So.
Just add a point that even between what Christina and Christine has said regarding the report, etc. I mean, I think it highlights one aspect of the local. It highlights one aspect of the local and global in terms of cultural policy, which is that it's also a function of whatever is a political system. So where the UK with its devolution of cultural institutions, etc., and also at least on paper saying its values of equity and diversity, and there are other political systems that don't prioritize those values and also don't operate that way, and that impacts how much local or global happens or is even desirable.
I mean, we like sometimes our events to happen more or less on time. We're hitting 92 minutes, so I think that this is actually, a good moment to actually start to wind down. First of all, Christine, Carolina, Aoife, Casey, thank you very much for sharing your work. Okay. Then, thank you to you, the audience, for being here and making this into an event, because without audiences, there are no events. Thirdly, I mean, as most of you who study arts management know, I mean, producing art is a collective action, as Howard Becker reminds us all the time, which means that to put this event together, an awful lot of people have contributed in various ways, and I think that this is the moment to thank some of them. So starting at the top, we have Kevin Fearon and John Grieve from Research and Enterprise at Queen's Belfast University for their support and their funding. We have the technical wizard, Alan Meeban, for filming this event so that we can have it as a memory for posterity. Then I would like to thank Queen's University Department of Drama. I would like to thank Trish McThigh. I would like to thank Mary Tumulty. I would like to thank Ross McDade and the fact that we can be in this wonderful venue, which is the Brian Field Theatre. Maria Meehan for helping us set up and organize the reception we're going to have afterwards. And then to the people who have provided the content, to Carolina and Christine for giving us some insightful ideas, and Christine particularly for leading a very inspiring and insightful conversation. I would like to thank my fellow supervisors, Kim-Marie Spence, Maria, I'm losing it, I will get your name afterwards, Maria, but for now you're basically Maria, Ali, and myself, Anders, and for the work we did to help our students. But most of all, I would like to thank Aoife and Casey, who are here, and Beth, who couldn't be with us, and the rest of you who have submitted your work in attendance. And I would just say that I think that as supervisors, we're extremely proud of you, and we thank you for taking the time to come here and join us. Thank you very much.